Tribute Pod production.
Feeling good? Here we go.
Welcome back to Open Secret, where we explore the power of open source intelligence one story at a time. Over the past 2 seasons, we've heard from practitioners who are using OSINT to tackle war crimes, disinformation, cultural theft, geopolitics, human trafficking and more. They've shared practical insights on building intelligence capability, sharpening critical thinking, communicating with influence, leading with transparency, and nurturing a global community. All up, these stories reveal something deeper, a field that's reshaping not just how we gather intelligence, but how we make sense of it and use it. So in this final episode of Season 2, Kylie and I are taking a step back to reflect on the bigger picture, the people, the principles, and the purpose of OSINT. We'll be unpacking the craft of OSINT and what it takes to turn open information into something decision makers can trust and, importantly, act on. Whether you're deep in the work or just starting out, this conversation is an invitation to think critically and creatively about the future of our field and your role in shaping it. Hi, Kylie.
Hi, Jane.
Well, here we are at the end of Season 2. Can you believe it?
I know, it's flown. It's been another rich season, though. So many different voices, and each one has challenged my thinking in a new way.
Yeah, I probably need to come clean about something, Kylie, and that is that when we kicked off Open Secret podcast last year, I just had this almost like a neat mental bucket labeled OSINTer in my mind, and it was a bit of a catch-all for anyone who was doing open source work. But I've got to say that certainly after the conversations that we had this season, that bucket's well and truly overflowed. We've heard from investigators, intelligence commanders, inclusion advocates, community builders, and all of those conversations have just expanded what I thought about, what OSINT was and who it was for. The idea that's really come home to roost for me this season is that there's no one way to be an OSINTer. The tools, the tradecraft, they might change, the targets come and go, but actually what persists is this blend of curiosity, shared values, collaboration, and that quiet courage, I'm going to call it, just to sit with complexity or ambiguity. So, what do you think? How are you feeling as we wrap up Season 2?
Oh, Jane, it's been such a ride. But I think you're right. This season has really challenged the traditional parameters of what we think OSINT is. And for me, definitely who it's for. I'm especially looking forward to this episode because I think it gives us a chance to reflect on those shifts and explore how the OSINT community continues to adapt, respond, and is really redefining its own boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why rather than go through the season in a straight recap style episode, you and I, we really want to dig into some of these big themes that have stayed with us. Let's head straight into a meaty one, talk about what it means when we talk about OSINT as a craft.
Oh, Jane, I think once you see OSINT as a craft, you start to see just how much care and judgment it really demands, which brings us to a bigger question in my mind. Who's actually doing this work? And how are they navigating the pace, the pressure, and complexity that comes with it? One thing that's really stood out to me this season is how much OSINT is being shaped not just by new tools, but by the people behind them. It's so easy to get swept up in the hype around AI, the speed, the automation, the scale. But underneath all that, there's still a craft to OSINT. And it's not just about collecting data, it's about interpreting it. And that means asking the right questions, applying context, and verifying what's real. And I think that takes judgment, not just algorithms. Anyone born after 1980 can probably be taught...
Or 1975.
Apologies, listeners. Can probably be taught how to scrape social media or run satellite imagery through a tool. But what happens next really does count. The decisions made in verification, the ethical frameworks applied, the level of rigor, that's what transforms raw data into intelligence that decision makers can trust. So when we talk about OSINT as a craft, I think we're really talking about a mindset, one grounded in discipline, critical thinking, and standards that can hold up under pressure. These aren't new ideas, though. Intelligence professionals have been honing this kind of judgment for decades, often under conditions where precision wasn't optional. And while these skills don't automatically transfer, into open source work, every guest this season has showed me that they can and should be intentionally cultivated. Considering this then, Jane, how do you think the OSINT community is doing when it comes to maintaining that level of rigor and judgment, especially in a time when speed and scale can so easily overwhelm quality?
Well, I think rigor and judgment are exactly what OSINT needs to be credible. And rigor and judgment are also, funnily enough, those first things that come under pressure when the going gets tough. When I think about my career, having built intelligence teams in government settings, but including to lead during major threat events, I've really experienced personally that temptation to trade precision for pace.
Absolutely.
And interestingly, I think that temptation is actually exacerbated in an OSINT context because you're in a situation where you're dealing with a source material that is publicly available. And therefore, that means that everyone has access to the same information. And so you can find yourself in situations where you're needing to collect, analyse, assess all of this publicly available information. And you've got senior decision makers breathing down your neck who might have well have seen the same original source information and formed their own conclusions, which may or may not be helpful, as we both know. I think where the discipline comes in is really remembering that the value add of intelligence is really what you're after here. That's the thing that comes from trusted synthesis, context, actionable insight. In other words, it's that whole sense-making activity that occurs with that information that creates the intelligence. It's not the information itself. You know, what struck me in this season, especially in those conversations that we had with Ritu and Terry, was how deeply discipline is embedded in their approach. They both spoke about responsibility that comes from the OSINT role, that responsibility to think about context and verification, ethical framing, as you identified. And they're just not nice to haves. In fact, they're foundational for any intelligence work, whether you happen to be working in the realm of secrets or in the open. Then you sort of add to that something that Olivia said when she spoke about that additional layer of responsibility that a lot of OSINT practitioners have, reminding us that our work has impact, sometimes in ways that we don't even see ourselves. If those conversations are anything to go by in the frame of the OSINT community, I think that the community is alive to those challenges. And from a formalisation perspective, we're starting to see some standards and structure emerge, particularly here in the US. There was a publication of intelligence community standards specifically around OSINT tradecraft. That's a useful guidance around transparency, objectivity, relevance. And even though those standards are US-centric, US intelligence community-centric, it's actually a really solid reference for anyone who's doing serious OSINT work. There's lessons to be drawn from that, I think. But the OSINT community is global, it's cross-sectors, decentralised. And so whilst we're not governed in the same way as classified intelligence communities are, and probably will never be, the crux of why we need to treat OSINT as a principles-based craft is to maintain trust in that decentralised environment, because we're never going to share chain of command. And so how do we kind of keep ourselves honest in that principles-based craft? I think it comes down to culture, actually. And it's that culture that becomes the ultimate custodian of keeping ourselves accountable.
Deep thoughts there, Jane. If we're to build on that, what do you think could be done, whether in training, culture or tools, to better support OSINT analysts in maintaining all that rigour?
Well, I think it comes down to your pet topic, really, doesn't it? In terms of what you need to do is create the right conditions for disciplined thinking or critical thinking, which we've spoken so much about. Yeah. Amen, sister. We've spoken so much about that over the last 2 seasons. It begins with intelligence tradecraft and analytical training, but you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You still want to keep that bread and butter analytical training and add onto that OSINT techniques and some of the new technologies that you need to be familiar with. But at the end of the day, analysts still need processes and frameworks to help them question and verify, contextualise information under pressure. And increasingly, they're going to also need to understand how those processes and frameworks are going to be helped or hindered by artificial intelligence. I'm a big fan of using contestability techniques as a part of the analytical process, meaning structured analysis, red teaming, simulation exercise, all of those kinds of things that you do as a part of the practice. But training alone isn't enough. And so that's where my passion for culture comes in. I really do believe that we need to build cultures where it's safe to challenge assumptions and admit uncertainty too.
Indeed.
Because it's those processes, the processes of contestability, that are so important. And it's not about weakening analysis. In fact, I think it sharpens it and makes your OSINT, your intelligence product, more decision ready if you've incorporated those processes. I guess the reason that I'm so passionate about it is because I think way back to when I started my career in intelligence, I recall one of my very early managers said to me, Jane, when you're doing analytical tasks, you must always think in your mind, what if you're wrong? What if someone else is relying on your analysis? That's not about inducing fear. It's about instilling an accountability. And it's something I still think myself today. It's hard to take that element out of our thinking when it's been indoctrinated.
Yeah, I think so too, Jane. Hard for us to get outside our own training and our own discipline in a way, but we've certainly tried to do that throughout these seasons, to be curious. And where I've landed too is, gee, there's a lot for the OSINT practitioner to think about, isn't there, when you unpack it all? I've noted across both seasons that the weight of expectation we place on OSINTers to do everything is a really heavy one. Do you think this is realistic?
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed this recurring myth as well of the complete OSINTer. And, you know, what you're thinking about in the OSINT context is often you have one person doing every step of the intelligence cycle, whereas in a traditional intelligence context, you have different people for different parts more often than not. And then also in OSINT, you're asking people to perhaps verify in 5 different languages, geolocate with pixel precision, maybe write like a Pulitzer winner, and still have time to mentor others and optimize their prompts for AI.
Of course.
It's a massive job when you put it all together. But I think, you know, that idea probably comes from a necessity, because a lot of OSINT professionals are one-man bands or one-person shops. We kind of understand that. But I think over the course of this season, we've had opportunity to think a little bit more broadly, a little bit more nuanced, and acknowledge that in the OSINT space now, there really is that opportunity for specialisation as well, similar to sort of the traditional intelligence community. Through the power of collaboration, the opportunity to draw on different people's specialisations can be really a fantastic force multiplier for you. We spoke to people like Ritu, for example, who really owns being a tactical analyst, Tim, and then Micah. In fact, everyone I think we spoke to in this season, actually, they spoke really openly about that value of partnering and collaboration.
I understand why people want to be full stack OSINTers, Jane, but I'm still convinced that leaning into specialised roles leads to better outcomes over time. It's proven to help avoid conflicts of interest and keep clear boundaries between collection, analysis and verification, and they each require different mindsets and quality controls. OSINT's versatility is definitely one of its strengths, making it accessible and powerful. But there's still a real risk in expecting individuals to do it all without recognising the value of specialised expertise. In traditional intelligence, we've long understood the importance of separating roles to make sure quality and timeliness aren't compromised. Each step demands distinct skills, and it's a heavy load for one person to carry alone. And that's why I think collaboration matters so much too. Strong judgment and sound decision-making come from bringing the right experts together at the right time, whether it's geolocation, language, as you said, behavioural analysis, or verification. These are specialised crafts. Honouring them doesn't dilute the work. It strengthens the final product.
100%. I agree with all of that. And I think it's interesting that you drew out the conflicts of interest there as one of the thoughts too, because you don't often think about that. You think about the heavy load in terms of all of the things that people have to do, but actually there's some oversight considerations in terms of what we think. I'm reminded, I guess, when we talk about this subject, actually something that came up last season when Gus Kangas was talking about OSINT almost being like a team of superheroes, if you like.
Oh,
and
that
so,
was a fun one.
Yeah.
We had a good time.
I love a Marvel reference. Everyone has different powers and no one's going to save the day alone. This season in Micah's episode, he reflected on that when he was talking about the analogy of the master electrician and their tool belt. Lots of tools, lots of skills, all used for a particular purpose. And the way I like to think about it now, having spoken with Micah and Tony, is this idea of skills inventory for OSINT. It sort of really feels to me like a collective invitation, perhaps a reminder that there are going to be gaps in our skill sets, but that's not an inherent failure. In fact, let's see it as an opportunity to grow or collaborate and include others. People don't see themselves in OSINT. Like I said, they're going to self-select out. We risk sort of then their participation, I guess, and their contribution and their brilliance. And I think that that's a huge shame. But, you're a gifted all-source analyst, having spent a long time in the field, as well as an intelligence leader. So has there been a time that you felt that you haven't belonged in OSINT?
First of all, you flatter me, Jane. I'll take it. But yes, absolutely, being candid. There have definitely been moments when I felt a bit like the doctrine police at an OSINT party. My focus on the intelligence process and the integrity of information has sometimes put me at odds with folks who are really output, and I don't mean outcome, I mean output driven, where speed and flashy results seem to be the main game. But honestly, a quick outcome means nothing if it's not the right one, or at least the best one available. As an all-source analyst, and apparently a gifted one, thank you, Jane, I lived and breathed a commitment to both quality and timeliness, because what good is intelligence if it's either too slow or it's unreliable? And later in my career, becoming an intelligence leader and consumer of intelligence, that commitment really did only deepen. I had seen firsthand how the sausage was made, so to speak, and how shortcuts can undermine decision makers and have real-life consequences, sometimes even be the difference between life and death. In the OSINT community, it does seem to me that there's sometimes an overemphasis on technology as the magic fix. And I understand that. And while tech absolutely plays a critical role in accessing information, it doesn't replace the human judgment needed to assess and interpret that information. And I will go to my grave preaching that. Luckily for me, there's a great opportunity now to train and grow the next generation of OSINT analysts, helping them blend that critical thinking with new tools so we get the best of both worlds.
So let's take a moment then to pause on this idea of the OSINT community that you and I have referenced a bit today. This season I think really celebrated OSINT as something of a collective strength. It's a shared space where people learn. I think there's a generosity amongst the professionals and there's a trust amongst them as well, although that's sort of an interesting concept that I'll ask you about, I think. What people are referring to when they talk about the OSINT community is that community of learning and generosity and trust. It feels open and global. It's peer-led and pretty dynamic. Very different to that environment that you and I are much more familiar with when we think about the traditional construct of the national level or allied intelligence community. Those are structures that are steeped in history. So what are your thoughts about this concept of the OSINT community? Do you think it's a real thing today, or is it more of an ambition that we're working towards?
It is different to the world we grew up in, but I think I land on that it's a real thing. Growing stronger every day, but it's also true, I think, that it's still very much in formation. The diversity of backgrounds, tools and approaches means we're still working out shared norms and practices. And one of the biggest challenges I see is balancing the pace of technological change with the need for rigorous standards and ethical guidelines that can hold everybody accountable. And it's clear from how much collaboration and knowledge sharing we're seeing right now that addressing this is a bit of a priority for the community. And despite our differences, people are genuinely eager to learn from each other and build trust across sectors. That's something that's really struck me across the seasons. That willingness to come together, whether through podcasts, forums, or joint investigations. It's a huge signal that we're on the right track and have a real community in the making.
This concept of generosity that really stands out for me as well. And, being on the podcast, asking for the numerous guests that we have done, we've benefited from that generosity and people's desire to, share their own stories for the purpose of learning and development of others, which is terrific. Where I go then is I think about generosity and then I parlay into other concepts around transparency and accessibility that, of course, we often also associate with OSINT. It's open, shareable, not just amongst the OSINT community, but in fact beyond it. It feels almost like that it's purpose-built for partnerships and collaboration in a way that perhaps is much more difficult for the traditional intelligence community, when you're talking about some of their methodologies that necessarily need to be protected. And so collaboration sometimes be much more difficult. It does raise some questions for me about how do you know when too much is too much and all of those kinds of things. And I think Ritu brought this up in a really pragmatic way when she was talking about how some OSINT techniques, when they're shared amongst the OSINT community, can actually be rendered useless overnight. So whether it's like a tech platform changing its back end or perhaps an adversary adapting, this thing around transparency or perhaps even oversharing can collapse the very access that we all rely on when it comes to publicly accessible information. And that can be frustrating, but it can also be operationally risky. And then Olivia challenged that perspective. Her framing was more about responsibility and in the certain context within which she's more familiar, working with vulnerable communities and so forth, how not sharing can be its own kind of harm. So it's a really interesting one to get into, I think. I mean, do you think that it's possible to overshare in OSINT? Quite separate from protecting our accesses to platforms, I'm really interested in your view about how the adversary might be watching us. Could they be studying our behaviours, maybe how we share amongst other people, our training materials, and using it to their advantage?
Adversaries absolutely study us. The way we share tools, public workflows, or even engage publicly in training and discussion. It's all observable. And if we're not careful, we're effectively mapping out our own capabilities and vulnerabilities. And I think that possibly is not as much in the mind of the OSINTer and the community as it is potentially in a traditional sense. From a counterintelligence perspective, any publicly available pattern of behaviour can be analysed, exploited and disrupted. And now, with AI in the mix, adversaries can scrape forums, replicate tradecraft, and use machine learning to detect our methods and anticipate our moves. We've seen Russian-linked actors use AI-generated personas to impersonate analysts, spread disinformation, and even produce fake OSINT-style reports to muddy the waters. It also raises serious personnel security concerns. The more openly analysts share their workflows, case studies, and digital habits, the easier it becomes for hostile actors to profile individuals, track attribution patterns, or even target them directly. In some cases, adversaries are doing their OSINT on us, mapping our behaviours the same way we map theirs. Of course they are. Why wouldn't they?
And it's important to know both too, isn't it? You've got to almost be gamekeeper and poacher when you're being so open online.
You do. And for OSINTers, they have to be all of that as well. Whereas in the traditional community, those functions are separated due to the different roles. But it's not just states either, is it? Criminal networks are watching too. In our episode on art crime, we heard from Tim how traffickers and looters monitor public OSINT threads to see what's being investigated. And in some cases, adapt their smuggling routes or methods accordingly. It was similar when we talked to Elisa on counter human trafficking. Oversharing can tip them off and collapse access just as fast as any algorithm change. And I think the tough reality is that adversaries often have the advantage. In fact, I'm going to go as far to say most of the time. They're not bound by the democratic norms, legal safeguards, or public accountability that we are. They can operate with more resources, fewer constraints, and far less regard for ethical or legal boundaries. So yeah, openness is powerful, but I think it has to be strategic because while we're building networks and sharing knowledge to strengthen the field, which we absolutely should be doing, both state and non-state actors are building countermeasures fast and without rules. So that's why thoughtful sharing grounded in ethics and operational awareness isn't just a professional courtesy or a handbrake, as some folks see it. It's a responsibility we all carry as part of this community.
When I think about my career, so often when it came to sharing, it was something that I did frame as a bit of a handbrake. It was something risky. But as you say, sometimes sharing is actually a strategy in and of itself. And so no longer can you necessarily say loose lips sink ships, but it's got to be a deliberate choice, of course. So tell me a little bit more about that in terms of the responsibility for openness and sharing as an act of leadership.
Responsible sharing is a must, and when done with intent and awareness of the risks, can be absolutely a powerful act of leadership. I've seen it used in intelligence diplomacy, where revealing just enough about what we know or how we know it can build trust, shift behaviour, and bring others to the table. It's not about giving away tradecraft, but about signalling values and priorities primarily, particularly in times of crisis and in the face of shared adversity. We can't win this alone. One example that comes to mind is post-crisis briefings, where sharing assessments, even selectively, has helped unify responses and counter disinformation. In the OSINT space, we also see this in how investigators use social media to call out abuses or atrocities. Sometimes making something public, knowing full well the risks of that, forces international attention or prevents a cover-up. That kind of calculated transparency, to me, isn't just brave, it's strategic. It shows that leadership in OSINT isn't just about what you uncover, but it's also about how and when you choose to share it.
Yeah, and for those leading in this space, that responsibility isn't an abstract one. It's certainly something that they're living day in, day out. No, it shows up in how they build teams as well. Terry spoke a little bit about that, how you support the people who are doing the work and hold space for the toll that it can take. You and I both agree that intelligence isn't for the faint of heart. There is a cost that goes along with it, and that cost is about bearing witness. And I think it takes both courage and humility, almost in equal measure. What are your thoughts in terms of how this all shapes the work and those who do it?
Gee, I've been thinking this over a lot this season, particularly as we had some guests that really talked to this quite directly, and probably more in a way than sometimes the work we do in the traditional community. The idea that in an age of distraction, bearing witness to inhumanity is an act of moral courage. I believe that. And OSINT has become a vital tool in that effort. I mean, a tricky one and sometimes a difficult one, but a vital tool. It allows journalists, investigators, and everyday citizens to expose harm in real time using satellite imagery, social media, or digital archives to uncover war crimes, forced disappearances, and systematic abuse. I know it's not as simple as the words that I speak, but as a concept, it's a strong one, I think, and an important one for the future of humanity in these times. But bearing witness isn't just about seeing, it's really about making the seen undeniable. Unlike traditional intelligence or journalism, OSINT is public, participatory, and often decentralised. You mentioned that before. That's its strength, but also its vulnerability. It can be manipulated, politicised, or dismissed, especially when findings challenge dominant narratives. And without clear standards, the same openness that enables transparency can also lead to poor tradecraft or the spread of misinformation. Many OSINT practitioners also work outside formal institutions, often without psychological support that's needed for confronting such work. I think the emotional toll is real. We just don't talk about it. And as the field evolves, we're learning that we need to prioritise ethics, well-being and community care to make sure we sustain the people doing the essential and brilliant work. But, despite these challenges, OSINT has had a real-world impact, to my mind, from verifying atrocities in Ukraine and Syria to restoring cultural heritage to exposing disinformation in real time. Its transparency really is powerful, yet might also be its greatest vulnerability. And I know this is something that you've thought about a lot too, because we certainly had these conversations off air. How do you think we protect the integrity of OSINT when its greatest strength, transparency, also leaves it open to manipulation or doubt?
Sometimes I think that you and I have some amazing conversations on air, and in fact we have longer conversations off air as a result of what people have said. So this one has definitely rolled around in my brain. I think that transparency has a potential to be OSINT's superpower, absolutely, but it comes with a kryptonite. As you say, it's a double-edged sword because, yes, anyone can scrutinise information sources, which does build trust. But, as you say, in this age of disinformation, that same openness makes it easier for perhaps people to twist or challenge or deny what's right in front of them. And so I can see time fast approaching. In fact, we're probably already there. And Olivia spoke a little bit about this, where the consumers of intelligence, they're not just questioning the facts, but actually they're arguing over what even constitutes truth. And that's a really wicked problem, I think, that we're facing. So I guess how do we protect integrity? I think that necessarily we start with tradecraft. We've spoken a lot about verification today, but verification is there. You've got to have transparent methodology, clear sourcing. So you need to cite your sources appropriately. And all of those things are hugely important building blocks, I think, for credibility. But there is also a mindset piece too. And so the analyst, the OSINT practitioner doing this work must expect scrutiny, in fact, engage with it and be really confident about saying to the decision maker and explaining their work, this is how I got there, and walk someone through step by step. And it does take confidence, and sometimes you need a really thick skin.
Always.
And that's going to complicate things now with generative artificial intelligence too, and how we incorporate that as a part of our open source intelligence workflows. But at the end of the day, you can use AI for efficiency's sake, but when it comes down to the judgment, the ethics, the accountability, that's all still going to be human work. And so it's kind of like a lot of fitness gurus say that you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. I think you can't prompt yourself out of bad tradecraft.
Some people might think you can. You cannot. And you've also talked about how different it feels doing this work in the open, Jane, that with OSINT, you're engaging publicly with harm and injustice. And that weight isn't tucked away behind closed doors for a selected few. It's out there for everyone to see. Do you think that kind of visibility brings a new kind of responsibility or ethical challenge?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely raises the stakes when anything enters the public domain, and I'm thinking sort of OSINT products here now. OSINT that informs and influences, that is absolutely going to bring with it an ethical responsibility. And I think it's that ethical responsibility actually that separates OSINT practitioners from the many, many online influencers. It means that, an OSINT practitioner, we have to be thoughtful, not just about what we share, but also how we share it and why. Is the verification solid? Could this product re-traumatise victims or expose them to additional harms? Are we sharing this for impact or profile? I often read stuff on LinkedIn where I'm questioning that in my own mind. And these are all kind of, I guess, what I would classify to be moral or ethical questions. They're not necessarily technical ones. To sum all of that up, Olivia was probably most concise here when she was talking about how bearing witness isn't ever neutral. It's an act of accountability. And so it's got to be done responsibly. Otherwise, it can indeed tip into harm. That's a long way to answer your question, to say that, yes, I think that the openness of OSINT is powerful, but it also brings real responsibility.
Integrity is shaped by the choices people make, especially those in leadership roles. To me, leaders set the tone for what's valued, protected, and rewarded. And when it comes to leading in fields that are changing rapidly, like OSINT, there's lots to think about. So there's extra responsibility and accountability there that needs to be front of mind.
One of the greatest lessons that I've ever learned about leadership is that it's really about having all the answers. It's about learning to get curious and build trust in uncertain environments, helping others see and engage with change before it hits them in full force. Terry's advice when he was speaking about learning your craft, its history and also where it's going really hit home for me. I can really understand the importance of that.
Spot on.
Yeah, I know that you loved it too. And I think he also said, read, and that
also
resonated
love
with
that.
you. Yeah, that's right. But, I know that you have a lot of wisdom in your own mind. And so when you're mentoring someone who's just entering intelligence or maybe even the OSINT field, what would you say is the leadership challenge that they're going to need to face in their careers?
I think people often expect me to point to a specific security threat, a new technology, or the sheer volume and complexity of the modern information environment. But the truth is, adversaries come and go. They always have. And to truly understand and counter the adversary, it always comes back to one constant for me, unsurprisingly, tradecraft. And to pass on strong tradecraft, this is the point about the leadership. We need committed people doing this work with care and discipline. It doesn't just happen. It's not magic, tradecraft. People have died for the evolution of good tradecraft. Very passionate about that. Not unlike Terry, one of the biggest leadership challenges I see is building and sustaining a workforce with diverse skills, experiences, and motivations. Intelligence demands a broad range of capabilities, and leaders must not only recognise those strengths, but actively cultivate critical thinking and adaptability. Tradecraft takes time to master. It requires deep understanding of your operating environment and, as I think we've referenced, the humility to remain open to the constant change. That's just not a word you throw around. That's a value. That kind of skill is built through reading widely, staying curious about the world and your adversary, and developing strong self-awareness, which is sometimes very confronting and painful journey, of which we all must go on. You simply can't do this work well without that foundation. I really believe that. And for today's generation, raised in a fast-paced, always on information environment, developing that depth can be particularly challenging. The good news? Well, with time and experience, analysts do become reliably quicker without compromising quality. But that growth depends on investing upfront and on creating supportive environments through strong leadership, because that's what keeps talented and motivated individuals engaged for the long haul. And we need that.
What I would probably add to that is the responsibility that leaders have to institutionalise the formal supports for individuals and teams in that context. Far too often in our modern work culture, I think it romanticises the grind. And so when you talk about being in it for the long haul, there needs to be, as you say, that focus on sustainability. And I've met OSINTers who are absolutely brilliant. They're committed, deeply resilient, but, they're also pretty burnt out. In some cases, they're isolated and they're carrying the weight of things that they've had to witness in the course of their work alone, and they're doing it all without any formal support, just to go back to a point that you raised. And so I think that as a leader, support can't just be, thank you, or some kind of virtual high five, job well done. Leadership demands more than that. And so the support has to be structural. And so that absolutely means embedding mental health and resilience into how we train, lead and build teams, and creating communities of practice that are safe and inclusive too, like what Micah and Tony were talking about. You and I have both led intelligence capability through moments of enterprise change. But of course, artificial intelligence feels unique and bigger. We're not just talking about technology, but it's a tempo too here, as well as I think really a shift in how we define value and judgment in intelligence. Here's a big one for you. How do you think that intelligence leaders really should be preparing their teams, not just for using artificial intelligence, but the thinking that goes alongside it?
Honestly, I think the first step is not getting swept up in the hype or overwhelmed with the complexity. Easy to say, less easy to do.
Yeah, easier said than done, yeah.
There is no doubt that AI is a powerful tool, but I say again, it is not a replacement for people or for good tradecraft. Leaders need to make that distinction really clear and be harnessing that, because while AI can speed things up, surface patterns and automate repetitive tasks, it cannot apply context, judgment or accountability. That's still our job. And I think the real opportunity here is to use AI as an assist, something that helps analysts get to the thinking part faster. And that means designing workflows that deliberately carve out more time for analysis, not just more outputs. We should be embedding AI experts alongside intelligence analysts, not off to the side, so we're solving the right problems and making the work more efficient. But just as important is building mutual understanding across those skill sets. Analysts need to understand what AI can and can't do, and technical teams need to grasp the operational reality that analysts work in. Often those two worlds don't meet very well, and that's definitely a place of opportunity. That's how we can make sure the tools evolve in ways that serve the mission, not just the technology. If we get that right, I think AI won't dilute the craft of intelligence. It will protect and strengthen it.
I think what's really come through so strongly in the conversation that we've had today is OSINT has evolved so much and is still becoming. And it's becoming not just because of these massive developments in generative AI, all the tools indeed, but it's also about the reach and impact and community of OSINT. Of course, none of this is light work. It takes rigor and resilience and commitment, and our efforts are keenly tech-enabled, but deeply human. And it's being done by people who believe the verifiable truth should be visible. I think, and this is not a question for you, Kylie, but it's just one that I'd like to leave hanging, if I may, and that is for everyone, really. What kind of OSINT do we want to build from here? Because the fact of the matter is it's not going to build itself. It's going to be about the principles we hold, the culture that we model, the care that we all bring. And of course, that's on all of us too. So if not us, then who? Well, Kylie, cue the glitter cannon, because it is a wrap for season 2. And across both seasons of Open Secret, we've met and spoken with some fantastic analysts, investigators, leaders and truth tellers using OSINT not just to inform, but protect, expose and hold accountable. And as the craft continues to evolve, so too must our understanding of the skills, structures and support systems that sustain us. Can I just say a heartfelt thanks to you for co-hosting with me again for this season?
Thank you, Jane. It's been a pleasure sharing the mic again with you and stepping into all these challenging and interesting and wicked problems.
And to our listeners, thank you very much for making space for these conversations. OSINT might be open, but the best insights are still to come for those willing to dig a little bit deeper. Until next time.
You've been listening to Open Secret, the power of open source intelligence. Open Secret was created by Kylie Pert, Amanda Shane and Jane Van Tienen. A podcast by OSINT Combine. Make sure to visit our website osintcombine.com for information on how OSINT Combine can help you find, analyse and act using open source information. Open Secret is recorded on the lands of the Cubby Cubby people. OSINT Combine acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the land where we work, live and learn.
Tribute Pod production.